Good morning, History 102. How are you? It's so good to be with you. I'm Dr. Tabitha Morgan, and I will be your handy dandy history teacher for this semester. I hope you got the book. I hope you've started reading it. I thought I had it here. Here I do. Ooh, sorry. Here's our book. Your cover might be a little bit different and the pages might be a little bit different. This is the first edition. There's probably a second by now. But it's all good. It's all similar enough. I'll go with that. We are reading like 3/4 of this book. There is no way to get through this class without having this book. I really need you to buy it. If you haven't bought it already, I sent you a video last month because I always get a lot of questions when a 10-week accelerated class. I get a lot of questions. Why aren't we starting? Where's this class? Why isn't this showing up? Because we're a 10-week accelerated. So we are starting Valentine's Day rather than starting when everybody else does for a 15-week class. So we are going to hit the ground running. We have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So last month I urged you to get the book. I strongly urge you to get it now as well. If you haven't already, please, please, please get the book. It's a really good book. It's really readable. And we're going to be reading basically the middle of the book. The front of the book starts way at the beginning of the United States, like our Native American beginnings. And then the end of the book goes up to Obama. Trump? No. Let's just say Obama, like till contemporary. And we, of course, are just in this class doing 19th century United States history. So we'll just be doing the bulk of the middle of the book. Okay. So that's first and foremost. So this is week 1. So every week I will post some version of this kind of video where I walk you through the module, where I give some kind of lecture, and I'm going to do that today. So please get out notebooks and a pen. If you're just sitting in bed, lounging, watching TV while doing this, that's one way to go, but I would strongly suggest you sit up, sit at a table, sit at the kitchen table, sit at a dining room table, or at least prop your computer on some pillows and take notes. And then the rest of the work is up to you. That's what an online class is. I open the modules every Monday and you can take the quizzes anytime you want. You can do the readings anytime you want. You also have the syllabus so you can read ahead. But the last day to do the quizzes is always Sunday night by 11:59. As I said in my other video, if you're late, it's a 0. There's nothing I can do. Please, please, please do not ask me to open back up Canvas. I cannot or I will not. It's just not going to happen. So just know that that's the schedule. Monday, everything opens. The module opens. Every week, the module opens. Wednesday, your discussion post is due. That's how I count attendance. By Friday, you have to reply to 2 peers. And by Sunday, your assignments are due. If you think I'm talking fast, I am. I'm from Philly. This is how I talk. Also, it's in the syllabus. So you can go back and see it anytime you want. All right, so let's dive in. So the really important things before the 19th century, before 1800 to 1899, that you need to know are really the beginnings, the core of how the country got founded, not started, because of course the country had started tens of thousands of years before people settled it, before they colonized, before colonization happened and created the United States as we know it as a government and governing body. But before that, there's a long history of Native American life, of visitors. People from China were here. The Vikings were here. Please keep in mind, Christopher Columbus never set foot on North America. Christopher Columbus stopped, and when he got very, very lost, and stopped in Hispaniola. Hispaniola is what is now called Haiti and the DR. It's that island. Christopher Columbus proceeded to kill millions of indigenous peoples, the Arawaks, Taínos, and he never stepped foot here, ever. So the fact that we would ever celebrate a Columbus Day is just historically inaccurate. And we definitely don't want to see any kind of, colonizer historical error be where our history starts. Our history starts always, every country's history starts with the indigenous population. So does ours. But what we're going to be talking about is, and if you're just coming out of History 101 into History 102, then you just covered like the American Revolution and all of that. So bear in mind, here's where you're going to want to start taking notes. Or you could have started taking notes. Christopher Columbus never landed here. He was a lost schmuck and a genocidal maniac. You could write that down. You can quote me on that. But also, you want to keep in mind that the American Revolution, so the American fight for independence from the British, was 1775 to 1783. Okay, 1775 to 1783. So it was late in the 1700s, right? It was really almost the 1800s by the time we got freedom from England and freedom from the monarchy, from monarchy rule, right? But so remember that then in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, Americans had British accents, right? Like the people who consider themselves Americans, land-owning, white, male, right? They had British accents. It wasn't like we came here, instant American, add water, shake, stir, like American. That's not the way it was at all. We were British citizens, we meaning just Americans, right? And what's most important about that, because this is history that's not in our time period, really. What's most important about that is that it took all this time, right? So the war ended, the American Revolution ended in 1783. The Constitution was drafted in where? Philly. We might have just lost the Super Bowl, but we're still Philadelphia. And we drafted the Constitution in 1787. So what's really important to remember is that it took all that time, right? It took 4 or 5 years from declaring independence to really being our own country. And it really was so late in the 1700s. 1787 is late. It's 13 more years and it's 1800. So what I mean, that's basic math, but what I mean by that is that this romantic idea of America just carved out this identity, and we always knew who we wanted to be, and we were fighting for freedom of religion and freedom of the press. That was never really the case. We were fleeing from persecution, and anybody who forgets that we all started as immigrants and refugees and kidnapping, trafficked victims, then they're really missing the history of the United States. So I really want you to keep in mind that you can order any kind of like little pocket constitution. I have this little tiny pocket constitution I love. I just sit and read it sometimes. It's when I'm watching like Love Island. Just read the Constitution. It's fun. You can get one of these at the Constitution Center. You can get them lots of places for free. So when the Constitution of the United States starts being written and ratified, it was first called the Articles of Confederacy. And we might think Confederacy, we might think Confederates, and those are like the bad guys who wanted slavery in the Civil War. The Confederacy, the Confederates, they created their own United States just to keep enslavement. Like, what is that? Well, the thing is that this country was started not as one country. It was started as a lot of little states, and they were all independent nations. We had no president. We had no Congress. It's kind of fascinating. So America's first document in 1781 was the Articles of Confederacy, and the government was just state by state by state. And it was these articles of like, okay, who are we going to be as these independent states? And if it's the same exact argument as we have now, right? So what happens if one state allows abortion and another state doesn't? What happens if one state allows gay marriage and another doesn't? What happens if one has death penalty and the other doesn't? So in each state, you are a totally different person, right? You can be put to death. You could have access to an abortion after you get sexually assaulted or not. You are married. I'm married to my wife in one state. I'm not married to her in another state. What is that, right? So why have independent states? Why have states' rights versus like federal identity? It's kind of fascinating. And one of the reasons is because they wanted independence and they, each state wanted its own identity. And that's great. I think we can understand that. I think we can understand like, Texas wants to be Texas, Tejas, and Philly wants to be, or, Pennsylvania wants to be Pennsylvania and Florida wants to be Florida. That's okay. When is it not okay, right? When does that not work out? When people don't have enough money to just move to a new state, when your family's been a part of one state for generations, and then you don't like the laws and you're going to have to move states to feel protected as whoever you are, as a trans person, right? If you have trans kids, you might want to move out of Florida, right? You might want to move out of Texas. So it's complicated. It's really complicated. So when we, the United States, is thinking through in the late 1700s and 1800s, like what we wanted to do, we modeled it on Europe. We modeled it on Europe having all these different countries like England, Italy, Spain, France, Netherlands, right? Like they each are their own identity and they each have their own culture and region and food and geography and terrain, right? And land. And it's beautiful and it works. And Europe is incredible. And you cross boundaries and you get into a whole other country. They speak a whole other language. And I think that's how our founding fathers kind of thought of it, right? Each state has its own unique flavor and spice, and if you don't like it, you move, that kind of thing. But it didn't kind of work out because we wanted to fight as one country. We wanted to fight against the British as one country. So what happens when you're a whole bunch of states and you say, no, everybody come together. We're going to be a union, right? We're going to be the union. And we're going to fight against the British and have this American Revolution. Does it work? Right? How do you have laws? How do you get each of the governors, the ruler of each state, to agree to come together? How are you a country when you're all these independent states? Well, one of the ways is to have a constitution of the United States, right? So hear that in a new way. It's United States. They're still plural. They're still multiple states, but they're united. So we go from just being British people making a country, right? Not the people who are, Irish indentured servants, African-American enslaved, Native American enslaved, right? We're not talking about that yet. We're just talking about the leaders of who gets to make the country at this point, right? Which are rich old British men. And they say, okay, we're going to be the United States, states' rights, but we have this sort of governing body. So on July 2nd, right, which is actual Independence Day, which is actually the day things got ratified, the Constitution of the United States says, and I quote, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form," you can say it with me, right? "In order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare," that means like well-being, "and secure the blessings of liberty," another word for freedom, "to ourselves, our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America." It's really beautiful, right? It's really beautiful wording. It's the very first sentence of the entire thing. And then it gets into Article 1, which is like the legislative powers. And it goes through about all the government bodies and how long presidents, do things and how they do things. So here's the thing. Does it work? Does it work? So we have, here we are, the United States, we the people, the United States of America, actually only is who, right? White people, white men, not women, landowners, so wealthy, and, you know, all the things that come after this, you know, all men are created equal, didn't mean all men. It didn't include women. Remember also that Native Americans weren't even seen as people, right? So it didn't include them. Lots of really, really problematic things end up happening from this one ostensibly beautiful document. Lots of untruths, lots of things that don't get, lots of people who don't get put in there, lots of things that don't get said. And remember that people or things being left out was not by accident, right? These founding fathers, such as they're called, Washington, Jefferson, John Adams, right? They're brilliant. They're brilliant, brilliant people. They're some of the greatest minds since Aristotle, right? And Plato. They knew who they were leaving out, didn't they? They knew. It wasn't like they didn't think of it. We have plenty of letters from Abigail Adams telling John Adams, you're not giving women their due. Like, they're well aware of who they're leaving out, right? And of course, you know, Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. He had 200 plus slaves, and his mistress of 20 years, right? Sally Hemings, was living in his home. So, and bore him many children. So these men leaving marginalized peoples and populations out was very, very much on purpose. So we need to reconcile ourselves to that. We need to reconcile and not just say, well, they were a product of their history. But there's always historical rebellions, aren't there? There's rebels, there's people who stand up to that history. So how and when do we give people a pass? And how and when do we stop and say, no, they knew better, they didn't do better. Let's go back, instead of shaming people, let's go back and figure out why. What were they serving instead, right? How was society being served by that, and how was it not, right? And who's being left out, right? Let's answer the questions, the who, what, where, when, and how, right? Why, and how. Okay, so the other thing I want us to remember is a little bit about history, and especially talking about this time period, the 17, 18, 1900s, is that our language changes. So, you know, back in the day, we would say Indians or American Indians, Native Americans, right? Our language changes around certain populations and people. And, you know, I'm a grown adult and I would have been called girl for, you know, forever, right? Instead of a woman or yes, ma'am, right? That kind of thing. So, or doctor. I wouldn't have been allowed to go to college for 300 years, right? Or more. So let's just keep in mind that our language is going to also shift and change, but trigger warnings around old-fashioned language. When we read things that are primary source documents, that's from the horse's mouth, right? That's an original document from that time period. And we're going to hear some rough language around all different governing ethnic bodies and genders, and just a lot of stuff. So trigger warnings around that. But keep in mind that we always, when we're talking about somebody or something or any kind of historical event, we in the present moment do not use antiquated language, right? We don't use antiquated language, even if we're talking about a past document. Okay. So, for example, one of the things that you'll hear me say a lot in this class is the enslaved versus slaves. So there's two reasons for this. One is because Blackness has become synonymous with slavery, and that's historically inaccurate. There were a lot of other groups that were also enslaved, particularly for us in the United States, Native Americans. Native Americans were absolutely enslaved and genocided and forced assimilation and culturally appropriated, as you can see by the Kansas City Chiefs, and made into mascots and dehumanized and all of that, right? So so it's not just Black shouldn't be synonymous with slave. That is historically inaccurate. It also is denigrating to Blackness, right? Blackness is not synonymous to slavery. So if somebody just says slavery, then we think Black slavery in the United States, and that's inaccurate. This leads me to my second point, is that we have to remember that we also don't just say slaves, because that becomes a name or nomenclature for an entire group of people, when in fact, that erases their identity and makes them just slaves, right? Rather than the enslaved, which shows that it was an action done to them, because they weren't slaves, right? They weren't, let me say, just slaves. Yeah. They were teachers and lawyers and medicine women and midwives and mothers and fathers and cousins and fishermen, right? And if you take somebody's identity away from them and just put slave label on them, then you're taking away their entire lineage and history and ancestry around who they were as a human being before they were enslaved, right? So we don't say the slaves of the United States. That's historically inaccurate because it's not including all the people that were enslaved. And that's not who they were. They were so much more than that, right? They were so much more than that. So we say the enslaved, and it might seem like the littlest difference, but it makes a big difference in how we conceive of an entire, millions of people that were brought through the Middle Passage. Okay, does that make sense? I hope so. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is that this history, speaking of Native Americans and African Americans, is the idea that this is American history, right? There's a lot of talk from conservative groups, especially in the South, about we shouldn't teach critical race theory. We shouldn't teach about slavery. It makes white people feel uncomfortable. There's so much happening in those sentences, and I don't want to unpack that too much or get too political, but let me just be very clear that Black history is American history, Native history, Asian history, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans. This is American history, right? This is American history. American history isn't white history. So if you have no interest in learning about the actual factual history that is diverse and inclusive and complex and problematic and all of these things, then you've got the wrong class. Okay? So we want to look at the truth of the way things were, and that includes slavery. And it's never meant to make anybody feel bad. It's meant to acknowledge a historical fact that still has reverberations today for Native Americans, Japanese Americans, and African Americans, right? Who all three groups were enslaved in their own ways. Okay. Okay. So I just needed to get that disclaimer out of the way. So what I want us to do this week is I want us to look at the very beginnings of this country. I want you to focus on the Constitution. I want you to focus on, I've provided links for summaries of the Constitution and like readable versions, right? So in our language, not the, the 1700s language. And I want you to go through and I want you to look at the beginning documents just to sort of get us situated and think about, here's your question. What were our intentions? I say like me, I, our all the time. What I mean is, what were the intentions of the founding fathers? What did they want this country to be? And how did they sort of set that up, right? How did they establish that through the Constitution? What did the founding fathers value? What did they say that they valued versus what they actually valued, right? And then what I'd like you to do is go through the rest of the module. Module week 1 is about the Igbo landing, and the Igbos are, well, I'll just let you see the module in there. So it's about the so we're going from the preamble, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, through to the Ebo landing, to sort of looking at a day in the life of African Americans. The thing I want you to focus on for the 1800s, just this week one is like 18, we're like finishing up with the late 1700s and 1800s, and early 1800s rather. And a day in the life of African Americans is really important to acknowledge, because I think a lot of the times when people think of African Americans in the 1800s or 19th century, which is our class, they just think about enslavement, and they just think about slavery as an institution, as a socioeconomic institution, and as an institution of dehumanization. And that is correct. Those things are accurate. It is a socioeconomic system of dehumanization. That's what slavery is. Yeah, write that down. Slavery is an institution of socioeconomic and dehumanizing oppression. Okay, that is accurate. The thing about it is that if we only learn about African American history from the lens of oppression, we're not seeing all the ways in which Black Americans fought back. We're not seeing all the ways in which the enslaved, the formerly enslaved, now freed, the born free, made into slaves, right? 12 years a slave, right? Somebody who's Solomon, who's free, and then put into slavery wrongly. We're not seeing all the ways in which that institution then takes people away from their identity, their humanity, their freedoms, right? And away from core American values. So this question of like, who gets to be American? Who gets covered under the Constitution of the United States? Who is the Constitution for, if it's not for all of us? Are really good questions. So the enslaved, learning about what you're going to learn about is the resistance practices. So you're going to learn about these big revolts in this class for Black history. You're going to learn about big revolts like Nat Turner, John Brown, Harper's Ferry, right? But we also want to look at daily resistance practices. What is a daily resistance practice by an African American enslaved person in the United States in the early 1800s? What is it to revolt against the system that is denying you citizenship and humanity? So some of the examples, if we were in class, you'd probably say learning to read and write. Yes, 100%. Learning to read and write, right? That was illegal. What about gathering? Remember, it was illegal for two or more Black peoples to gather in one place at one time after sundown, right? And we still have sundown towns. Yeah. It's hard. There are still sundown towns. Yeah. But let's also go a layer deeper, because that's stuff you might have learned in high school. That might be stuff that you've thought of on your own, right? But what about Black love, right? What about that it's illegal for Black people to get married, so that falling in love becomes a resistance act, right? Black love becomes a revolution when these entire countries are putting you down, right? What about daily things like taking food from the kitchen, right? What about working just a little bit slower to make sure that you have any modicum of energy left when you get home for your children? Right? That all of these things are resistance acts, not only to the institution of slavery, but the dehumanization of enslavement, right? Right? So this is what you're going to look at in the module this week. You're going to look at African-American photo montage that has links at the bottom that has about active resistance acts, passive resistance acts, large versus like daily resistance acts. And again, going over the founding documents. Who were they written for? Why were they written? What were the original documents? How were they changed? For example, how does it change that our documents were based on multiple things? One was a Native American constitution we totally stole, and the other is John Locke. And John Locke said that the core of freedom is life, liberty, and the pursuit of, y'all are going to say happiness, aren't you? But that's our version, the American version. The original version said life, liberty, and the pursuit of, any guesses? Private property. What about that? How does that change? How does it change that it's like, go find life, liberty, and private property so you can build a house, have a workshop, start a job, right? Create your own workshop, metal shop, wood shop, right? Carpentry business, farm, right? Private property. You could feed yourself, clothe yourself. You could, private property, the embracement of private property gives you equal access to capitalism and like the American dream. But no. Our founding fathers changed that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What? Happiness? How are you going to guarantee my right to happiness? What? That's vague. That's some vague shit right there. What is that? Wait, I want my private property back. Right? I want my private property. Then I can plant fruit trees, right? I can plant trees. I can clothe myself. I can house myself. What's your freaking happiness? I want my private property. No. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that was a lot of information. Go through the module, take the week, this is Monday. You have until Sunday when the assignments are due. Remember, Monday, the module's open. Wednesday, your original discussion post is due. It's how I take attendance. Friday, you need to reply to 2 peers. Sunday, your assignments and or quizzes are due. Take all of this information. Just go through the modules bit by bit by bit. Remember that I put them in order because I'm curating this experience for you. Don't just go click on every damn thing. Do it in order. I really curate it like an art gallery. I'm like setting it up to show you something to build to the final thing, right? So do it in order and trust me, trust the process. I love history, as you can tell. I love history, and I have been teaching college for 23 years. This is my 23rd year of teaching at the college level, and I really, really love it. And I want you to love learning too. If you don't already, I want you to just be fired up about all this and learning just everything you can and just soaking it all in, because that's the only way we make change today. All right. Yay. Welcome to History 102, 19th century United States history. I'll see you next Monday in my next video. And in the meantime, you're a 10-week accelerated online class. So get to reading.